Okay, and I'm gonna cede the floor to, I almost called you Cyrus, Corey.
Thank you. Everybody virtually, everybody here. I know a few of you. My name is Corey House. I'm actually our lead .NET recruiter for the state of Florida. We support everything here in Orlando, everything in Florida, and then also nationally. I would say that .NET is not just all we do, though. We've got every and any position. We have specialized recruiters within each of those skill sets. So if you guys ever know of anybody who's curious about what's going on in the market, not like, hey, I need a job today, but we can do that as well. We're very open to, hey, what are you looking for? When are you looking for it? And just trying to help you identify it. I know I've worked with Dave before, so excited to be working with all of you guys. Hope this is a great event. And thank you guys.
Thank you, Corey.
Yes, sir.
The floor over to Shaun.
All right, I'm going to transition over to my slides now. I'm assuming everyone can see my slides and everyone can hear me.
Yepers.
All right, cool. All right. All right, so I've been doing a lot of talking this week. When I was first invited to be a speaker for the ONETUG event, I was given a couple of dates, and it just turned out that there's also a live 360 conference that's going on in Orlando this week. And so I was able to do a couple presentations there and then also add this one on to my week. So it kind of worked out well. But it also means that that's all I've been doing this week is presenting. So I feel like public speaker now professionally or something. I'm doing a different presentation at this event than I've done at the other two sessions I did this week. This week I covered a pretty big deep dive into WebAssembly. That's what I did this morning at Live 360, and I also did a session on Blazor Hybrid and Maui earlier this week. And so that seems to be my area of specialty, I guess you could say, in the last 5 years or so. Is very much embedded in the Blazor community right from the very beginning, and then working with all of the new technology that keeps coming out from the team. And of course, there was .NET 8, which was released this week, right, with a bunch of new stuff. So I'm going to touch a little bit on that as well in this presentation. I guess you're now probably wondering why this slide says Oqtane. And so I guess I should probably give a little background about myself. So it's interesting. On the way out on the drive that Andy gave me a ride to the event today, I was saying that I think the last time I spoke at ONETUG was like 10 years ago. And so I remember I went to an event, I think it was in Tampa or Sarasota, and I volunteered to speak at a ONETUG event and drove out to Orlando. And I talked about .NET Noob. Because so that's sort of my original claim to fame, is that I was the original creator of .NET Noob. And so a lot of .NET developers have heard of it or remember it because they might have used it a long time ago, because that was a solution that was created, I think, 2002, 2003 timeframe. So, 20 years ago is a long time when it comes to technology. The interesting thing is I'm still running across folks that are still using .NET Noob. So it's kind of interesting how it's far exceeded sort of the life expectation that I had for that product. I actually haven't done anything with .NET Noob since probably 2014. But it's still available as an open source solution. It was an interesting sort of journey for me there because it was created as an open source product. It was one of the first open source products that was available on the Microsoft platform. And so that was late 2002, 2003. And at that time, the Microsoft community didn't really know what open source was, right? That was like a Linux thing, that was something that was happening in a completely different area of the tech industry. Even Microsoft itself didn't really, I think, know how to approach open source at that time. And so that didn't stop people from realizing, hey, this is like something that I can download for free and use. And I have a lot of rights and a lot of freedoms to use it however I want to, right? And that's not something that Microsoft developers were familiar with either. Usually had to pay a license for things. So there was a lot of adoption, and Microsoft itself, at least the ASP.NET team, was pretty friendly towards it because they saw that it would help with the adoption of ASP.NET, which was brand new at the time. So I think that sort of one complemented the other. And so there was a lot of adoption of that product. Ultimately, we created a company around it. We got 3 rounds of venture capital. So we created like a fairly large company around it. I think we ended up with like 2,000 or 3,000 customers because eventually we did come out with a commercial version of the open source product. And so that was an interesting journey, and that sort of ended for me in 2014. It ended a little bit abruptly, like I wasn't sort of expecting that that was going to be the end for me, but I sort of like it was interesting after like being the creator of that technology, being sort of the, I guess, chief architect or chief product owner for all that time. We ran into some challenges with growth, and we had, of course, investors on board. They became a little bit anxious about the fact that it wasn't growing in the way that they were hoping it would. Things got a little bit more tense internally. Ultimately, I got fired from my own company. So it was like a super kind of abrupt end for my journey with .NET Nuke, but that it was actually a blessing in disguise because it forced the decision for me, right? Because I don't know if there was really a future beyond where we got to with .NET Nuke. The technology would have had to have been completely rebuilt. The industry had changed. There was a lot more competition. And so it forced me to like get out of that sort of ecosystem and look at things that I wouldn't normally have had the chance to look at and become a consultant again for a while. And so it was good. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I was a Microsoft MVP for things probably like 12 years with my time with .NET Nuke because it was a very community-oriented open source solution. And then at some point, Microsoft sort of reworked the MVP program, and I didn't get renewed. And so for a period of about 5 years, I wasn't an MVP. And I have to say that getting, like, sort of becoming an MVP once again I felt was like probably a bigger accomplishment for me than it was the first time. Because as I got later into my career, I realized like it's actually pretty hard to become an MVP. You have to get nominated, people have to vote for you. And so like I've been really grateful to be an MVP for the last couple of years again. In the last 5 years or so, I've been involved with Blazor and the Blazor technology a fair bit. And almost immediately when I saw Blazor, I saw the potential to build another web application framework, much the same as what I had done with .NET Nuke, because Blazor has a component model, which is very powerful, much like the original web forms component model. And so I saw that, in order to build very rich dynamic applications, Blazor could be used for that. And so that's why I sort of got interested in Blazor early on and kind of moved forward from that. I'm also involved with the .NET Foundation. Andy and I were talking about that on the way in. So the .NET Foundation was formed in 2014. I almost became the first executive director. But in 2014, Microsoft had a big layoff of, I think, about 5,000 people. They had a hiring freeze. And at that point, like I had kind of interviewed and I was sort of in line, but then they decided that they weren't able to hire anyone. And so they had to give that role to somebody within Microsoft. And so, which was probably fine in the end. But since then, I've been a volunteer with the .NET Foundation for the last 10 years in various capacities, never on the board, but always a volunteer on various committees. Right now, I'm on the project committee. We review applications to the .NET Foundation for open source projects. So if you have a large open source project that's based on .NET and you might want to become affiliated with the .NET Foundation, there's an application process, and then the project team reviews it, and there's public sort of criteria that we look at in terms of like whether there's a community around this project. Is there more than one contributor to it? Is there a lot of adoption of it? So those types of projects are the ones that become official members of the foundation. And then we also have a seed category for those who don't meet that criteria, so that we can sort of help them get some visibility, and then hopefully ultimately they'll grow and become larger open source projects. So I don't know, I'm assuming at this point in time, everyone knows what Blazor is, but I'm going to just cover a few slides about Blazor. And so this was introduced by Microsoft in late 2017, early 2018 timeframe. So, 5 or 6 years ago. And Blazor is a single page application framework, right, that's designed for building interactive web applications on .NET. And usually the other definition that you see is, for building interactive web applications on C# rather than JavaScript. So those were some of the big sort of benefits that Microsoft was touting when they came out with Blazor is, if you are a Microsoft developer and you don't necessarily like writing stuff in JavaScript and you want to build a single page application, you should have an option to do that. And you should be able to use your language of choice, which is C# to do that. And so this is where Blazor came from with its sort of rich component model. And it was allowed you to build interactive applications using C# on both the front end and the back end. And I think we're all pretty familiar with the architecture now of single page applications, right? Usually it's with a JavaScript framework, but typically your browser makes a request to the server, it gets the initial payload back for your page, and then all of the processing around the UI rendering happens in the browser itself, typically. Right? That's the way a SPA application usually works, is like the JavaScript framework takes care of the UI rendering. And the only calls that are made back to the server are to get data over API calls. So it's essentially a client server type of an architecture using a framework in the browser. And so typically that had been a JavaScript framework that you would use for the front end, but Blazor allows you to use C# on the front end to have this SPA-like architecture. And so, why did Microsoft come out with Blazor and sort of what problem is it trying to solve? So I think in the last probably 10 years, you've seen organizations, any organization that has a large application that they need to build or maintain, they tend to have a need for multiple types of resources now, right? They'll have front-end resources and back-end resources. The front-end resources are skilled with these frameworks like JavaScript frameworks, so they're familiar with that kind of technology. And then the back-end folks are building APIs using .NET, right? And doing the back-end workloads on .NET. This dissonance between like the two groups is a little challenging sometimes. I think most of us have gotten used to it in larger organizations, but the problem specifically that Microsoft thought they could solve is, why do you need to have two different teams with two different specialized types of resources? Why can't you just have a full stack developer that can use C# on both the front end and the back end and build full stack applications, right? Web applications, SPA applications. And so this is why they came out with Blazor. And I have a picture of a unicorn here because often you'll see like companies advertising for roles where they want someone who's an expert at JavaScript and an expert at .NET, right? They want people to be experts at all these different technologies. And usually those kind of folks don't exist, or if they exist, they're very expensive. And so that's why you end up with having dual roles, right? You'll have a front-end person and a back-end person. Well, that costs the company a lot of money, right? Because those two people are probably not always busy doing the development work, right? You could probably get away with a lot of the time having one person to do both front-end and back-end. But, those skill sets are very, very different. So that's one thing that Blazor was trying to solve. The other is like just the disconnect of communication, right, between front and back end, right? You'll have the front end developer who says that they have certain needs, and they'll try to communicate that to the back end. But often when the two come together, it's not like a perfect fit. And so if you had developers that could deal with both front and back, you don't need as much communication, right? It's a much more fluid sort of way to build an application. So I thought that these photos were a little interesting that I found online about this particular problem. So Blazor, there is obviously this component model that is part of Blazor, and Microsoft, the component models have been around a long time. Microsoft had a component model with web forms. Component models sort of fell out of favor, I would say, for a while. At least in certain types of applications, like when Microsoft came out with MVC, right, in 2009, 2010, that didn't really have a good component model around it, right? It didn't have a way to build like UI widgets It was more of a server-based technology. You would build entire pages of content. And so we kind of went away from this component model concept for a while. And so I think what happened was these JavaScript frameworks became very popular, like React, Angular, Vue. They all have excellent component models that are part of them, right? For building UI widgets using JavaScript. And so Microsoft saw that and said, okay, I guess component models are back. We better create something so that C# developers can build components, as well using a model. And so they added that to Blazor as one of the fundamental concepts. But the interesting thing with Blazor is that although you can build components using C#, they're very versatile. So you can actually run these components in different ways. And so the first runtime sort of hosting model that Microsoft came out with was Blazor Server. That was the first version of Blazor. And essentially it used SignalR, so WebSockets, to be able to communicate between the client and the server. So if you spun up a Blazor Server application, each client that connected would have a WebSocket connection, and that WebSocket would be responsible for updating the user interface, right? The browser content. And it wouldn't refresh the entire browser content. It was using, intelligent sort of diffing algorithms, much like you have in React or Angular. But all of that communication was happening over a WebSocket. And so that provided a very fast, sort of like responsive application that emulated what you would get in a JavaScript-based single-page application framework. And so that was quite powerful. There are some downsides to Blazor Server as well, in that, of course, you have a WebSocket for every user that connects. WebSockets consume resources, right? So there are scalability limitations, right, around Blazor Server. And then the next thing that Microsoft released was support for Blazor WebAssembly. And Blazor, like WebAssembly, is not a Microsoft thing. WebAssembly has been around for more than a decade, and it actually is an industry standard now. So multiple vendors have come together and agreed that this is a good thing. It's like the only other technology other than JavaScript which runs natively in a web browser today. And it's shipped with every major web browser since like 2017. So it's been around for quite a while. I think the story behind WebAssembly is kind of interesting, at least on when it comes to Microsoft and Blazor. There's a developer on the Microsoft ASP.NET team named Steve Sanderson. You probably heard that name before. I don't know. Steve Sanderson was the original creator of Knockout.js, which was quite popular, maybe a decade ago. He's a super smart guy, always kind of pushes the limits of technology. And in 2017, and this is right around the time that WebAssembly became very sort of available in all of the major browsers, he did a presentation at NBC Oslo, which is one of the big developer conferences. And he demonstrated a bunch of web technologies that were sort of new and cutting edge. But the one part of his demo that he did is he demonstrated how to run a C# application in a browser on WebAssembly. And he never told anyone at Microsoft, like, sort of what he was going to be doing in his demo. And so as rumor has it, that like there's a lot of Microsoft folks that were at NBC also in the audience, and they were just blown away like at what he presented, because they had no idea that he was going to, showcase this, and he had no idea how he had done it. So that prompted Microsoft to kind of say, okay, well, that's pretty cool, right? We need to actually explore that further. They brought it in-house as an experimental project for a period of time. And then ultimately it became a real project, and there's been multiple iterations of it. But that's how it sort of came to be within Microsoft. That was the origins of Blazor, so to speak. And so it really originated as a WebAssembly concept, but then once the component model was created, they realized, hey, we can actually like leverage this component model in a variety of different ways. So that's why we have Blazor Server and then Blazor WebAssembly. The concept behind Blazor WebAssembly is that when a client connects to a web client connects to the server, it actually downloads your .NET assemblies to the browser and then it runs those .NET assemblies directly in the browser natively on top of WebAssembly. So it is actually running your .NET code in the browser, which is quite interesting. There's a lot of sort of magic under the covers on how that works. And in fact, it was because of the Xamarin acquisition by Microsoft, where they acquired, some of like Mono. Mono plays a key role in all of this because it's cross-platform. They needed cross-platform in order to run .NET in the browser. So there's a lot of different pieces that all sort of came together with this, but that's how Blazor WebAssembly works. And then most recently, well, I shouldn't say most recently because this is a couple of years ago now, with the release of Maui, right, .NET Maui, Microsoft adapted again that Blazor component model to be able to run in a web view component that could like basically allow you to create a hybrid application, which could run on desktop or mobile, right? So basically using the same component model, the same components that you would build using .NET, you can actually run those natively in a shell, so to speak, right? A desktop shell that might be on Windows, it might be Electron, or it might be mobile, right? Like an iOS shell or an Android shell, but it's a web view component. Web views are not new either. Like web views have been around a long time. If you've been using like Ionic or Cordova, right? Those are all sort of hybrid approaches that use web views. Blazor does the same thing. And so that allows you, again, to use the same technology to target multiple operating systems and multiple devices. So it's pretty versatile, pretty powerful. And so that allows you to target a web initially, but then also expand that to desktop and mobile, right? So that's a pretty powerful proposition. And so I think the interesting thing with Blazor was early on, when people heard about Blazor, they initially saw it as a technology that was targeted at running stuff in the browser, right? Creating single page, rich sort of interactive single page applications. And immediately they said, oh, this is like Silverlight version 2, right? And because of that, they said, okay, I'm not touching this, right? I'm not gonna use this because we already know what Microsoft did to us with Silverlight. They got us to adopt it and then they pulled the rug out, right? And now we have like a mess to deal with. So I'm not gonna touch Blazor. Now we're 5 or 6 years into this and we've seen how they've adapted it to a bunch of different scenarios. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on about .NET 8, because again, this is, there's even more stuff with Blazor and .NET 8. And I think you can see that all of these worlds are converging on Blazor now, right? Like Microsoft ultimately doesn't want to support so many UI frameworks as they have today, right? Web Forms, MVC, Xamarin, right? Blazor, like how many UI frameworks do they ultimately need? And how many resources do they want maintaining all of these things long term? That's not a great business decision. So I think they're trying to lead the .NET developer community in a certain direction. And it seems like Blazor is the concept which is pulling them all together. We shall see if that happens, but it definitely seems like it has the momentum right now, because if you pay attention to the marketing message from Microsoft, it's all about Blazor, right? Like .NET 8, huge focus on Blazor. So, and you hardly hear any conversations anymore about MVC or some of the more, I shouldn't call them legacy because there's tons of applications built with them, but it's always like if it's not the latest greatest thing, it's legacy essentially, right? So okay, yeah,
Still fully being
it's
integrated on and all, or
so yeah. So web forms, it's funny because web forms is never going to go. Well, I shouldn't say never, but web forms is tied to Windows. So as long as Windows is supported, web forms is supported, right? .NET, it's part of .NET framework, and so that's an actually interesting, ironic kind of thing. Is that with .NET, the new .NET, which was like .NET Core rebranded, the .NET 8 just came out this week. It's a long-term support release, 3 years. That's long-term support, right? Whereas like .NET Framework is supported indefinitely, right? It could be around 10, 15 more years. That's long-term support, right? but it, it's sort of this new world is like, it's all about evolving more quickly. And so web forms is not being innovated on. It's not being enhanced, right? It's being maintained, which, yeah, so you won't see any new features. .NET Framework itself is not being enhanced anymore, right? It's sort of been frozen, but it's very mature, right? There's a ton of applications that run on it. So the fact that it's actually not being enhanced actually probably makes it more mature and stable, right? So, but anyways, yeah, so, but over time, those applications that were built on .NET Framework probably still need to be migrated to something else at some point, right? There is no forever with technology. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Oqtane now. And so, like I said, I got involved with Blazor almost from the very beginning. I think it was still an experimental product when I first started looking at it. I hadn't even heard anything about it. And I've known Scott Hunter for quite a long time from my .NET Noob days. He spoke at a number of our conferences. And he actually texted me and said, hey, have you looked at this Blazor thing? Right, I think you might find it interesting. And I think what he meant is because it has a component model, it has much of the characteristics that web forms had. And he knew what we were capable of building with web forms. The .NET Noob was, of course, web forms based. And so I immediately saw the benefit there. But I also, there was a number of things that I was trying to solve with Oqtane when I created it. One thing which drives me mental about the Microsoft technology is that the templates that they provide you to get started are terrible, right? They're like, they're almost worse than Hello World, right? Like if you try to spin up an application using like a Blazor application, like it has literally, like it doesn't resemble a real app at all, right? Like it demonstrates such a very thin layer of functionality that you're still left with tons of questions. Like, how do I actually build an app? Right? It doesn't do data access. It doesn't have services. It like has nothing. And so I was like, okay, we need something that's a little more advanced than Hello World, right? And the Microsoft templates. And so maybe Oqtane has gone much beyond that, like maybe too far beyond that now, because it's quite rich in functionality, and that's what tends to happen when you build a framework. But it is open source, so at least you can crack it open and you can see examples of how to do a lot of different things, which is very helpful, right? If you run into a scenario that you need to solve, you could pretty much find an example of it being done somewhere in the framework, right? And then you can like have a real working example on how to like emulate that functionality. And so, application frameworks, this has kind of been an area that I don't know why I've gravitated towards it in my career, because I've built a number of different frameworks. It is a different mindset building a framework versus an application, because as an application, you're building on top of a framework. Whereas a framework, you always have to be more considerate of the what developers need in order to build applications. Also preserving compatibility so that you don't break their applications by making modifications to your framework. You have to be more deliberate about the architecture because you don't have the ability to change it so easily as you do with an app. Because if you change the architecture of a framework dramatically, you're going to break all the apps that are on top of it. So it's a very different mindset. But the whole idea with frameworks, right, is they're designed to accelerate your development process, right, and automate a lot of the overhead that it takes to build applications. So literally, it's just a lot of glue code, right, that you shouldn't be rewriting every time. Some of this stuff is very commodity and like commoditized, and you shouldn't have to rebuild it in every app that you build. It should be provided for you. And so obviously, like Blazor and .NET Framework and all of these frameworks from Microsoft provide you with a base level of functionality, but they never venture into certain use cases. Or at least traditionally they never have. Like a good example would be multi-tenancy. Like none of the Microsoft tools provide multi-tenant capabilities. That's something that is put on the developer to try and figure out on their own. Well, that seems pretty commodity at this point. They're like, why does everyone have to build their own multi-tenant capabilities? That seems like a waste of time. So things like that. There's like an opportunity for a higher level framework that runs on top of the Microsoft frameworks and gives you that extra layer of functionality. Code reusability, another sort of important aspect that I've always been keen on is, I maybe I'm kind of lazy, but I don't want to write things over and over and over again that are very similar, right? I'd rather abstract those things and reuse them over and over again if possible. I don't think I even fully understood the potential for this code reusability when Blazor first came out, because I didn't know all of the plans that Microsoft had. But I'll be able to demonstrate today, like with Blazor, you could write components and without any code changes whatsoever, those components can run on all of those hosting models that I presented earlier. So a component can run in a web browser. It can run using either hosting model, right, using WebAssembly or a server, and it can run on a desktop. It can run in a mobile device, right? Like without any code changes. That's pretty crazy, right? That instead of having to write individual applications for every single scenario, you can actually share code across a lot of scenarios. You give up some things by doing that, right? Because you can't write, you're not writing a bare metal application for each device or platform at that point. But as a business, it's not always about, or bare metal is not always the most important thing, right? So sometimes cost is the most important thing. Like sometimes cost is the most important thing. Usually cost is the most important thing. So that's a pretty important aspect. Modularity is also something that Microsoft talks about a lot. And in fact, I would say, like with their component models and things of that nature, there is a lot of potential for modularity. But the interesting thing is that I don't think that they take it far enough sometimes. Like for example, in Blazor, of course, you build components. You can use a ton of components within an application, but that application can still be compiled into ultimately one assembly. That's not modular, right? It's using some modular concepts, but it's still one big monolithic application with a bunch of components embedded in it. You can take it further and you can actually abstract the components into individual projects, which become individual assemblies, right? And really break things down into smaller parts. And then use composition at runtime to bring it all together again. Like that's what I think about when I think about modular. And I think about things being like broken apart independently and then brought back together again at runtime. That's typically not what you're going to see in the Microsoft templates. That's like not the examples that they're going to provide. And that's because it is a little bit more complicated to build applications like that. Performance was also a key consideration for building Oqtane. Coming out of the .NET framework world with .NET New, we had tried really hard to get great performance out of it, but there were certain limitations with .NET framework that you just couldn't overcome. There were certain default behaviors that, like the fact that when an application on .NET Framework starts up, right, it has to load everything from the bin folder into the app domain. Like there's just certain things that are like you can't get past. And so .NET Core, I mean, that's why Microsoft came out with .NET Core originally, right? It's like strip it down to bare metal, start over again using a completely different model. And so I wanted, obviously, this Oqtane framework to get the most performant capabilities as well. And so I guess sort of the key things around Oqtane are that it does accelerate the development of modern digital experiences. So you can build many different types of applications with it. And it does this by providing a set of building blocks that you can use. It's open source under an MIT license, which is one of the most liberal licenses in terms of the freedoms that you have available. It is a member of the Microsoft, not the Microsoft, but the .NET Foundation as well. And it has been using Blazor and .NET MAUI since early stages. I did come up with like a whole philosophy early on around the open source project, because one thing that tends to happen in open source is you will have people that want to use the technology and they will have their own ideas, right, about what they think it should be capable of. And those ideas don't always align with the vision of the original creator of the open source project. And so sometimes instead of like having community members find out the hard way, like especially if they've like really invested in building out maybe some really cool functionality, and then they submit it as a pull request and the maintainer says, yeah, I'm not interested in that. It's really demotivating, right? Like in open source, that's not a great model for building a community. So it's a little bit better to be upfront and say like, these are the philosophy, like these are the key goals that we're trying to achieve here, right? And so then it's easier when someone approaches it, they say, oh, I had this idea and I think it aligns with these goals of the open source project. It's more likely that my idea is going to be accepted, my pull request will be merged, right? So a lot of open source projects don't do this. I kind of regret that we didn't do it with .NET early on. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that I at least provided some guidelines early on with the open source project. Architecture of Oqtane. So it does use like the client server model. Ultimately, I guess, I started the same place that anyone would start when they're starting with Blazor. I did use the Hello World template. I used the WebAssembly Hello World template because I knew that if I was going to support a bunch of different use cases, I needed it to be client server, right? Because that's the only architecture that's going to work across the most scenarios, right? If you're going to support, if you're only doing web, it's okay to not be client server. But if you want to support desktop or mobile or any other type of client, then you need to be client server. You need to have a focus on splitting the responsibility, right, between client and server. And so on the server side, using .NET Core, using EF Core, Oqtane has its own repository for the entities that it manages. It's got its own REST API layer. It's using the I-hosted service interface that's part of .NET Core for background processing, scheduled jobs. And it supports multiple databases, which I'll talk about in a minute. On the client side, it's using Blazor, and it supports all of the different variations of Blazor. And it has its own sort of service layer on the client side, which essentially just provides strongly typed wrappers around HTTP client calls to the server, so that you get like nice strong type assembly objects and collections back that you can use in the client. And then it uses multi-tenancy, and it basically creates a composable UI at runtime, much the same way that .NET Nuke worked, right? So everything in .NET Nuke is essentially dynamic, like dynamically created, and Oqtane follows the same model. One of the things, like I touched on earlier, was multi-tenancy. So multi-tenancy has been a concept that's been around for a long time. It's ultimately the ability to share infrastructure in a way that you can save money, right? That's what it boils down to, right? Is like getting more usage out of infrastructure by running more clients on that same infrastructure, but separating them, of course, in some way so that they're not like commingled together. You have to have some way to separate them. And there's a variety of different ways to do this. I feel like in recent years, multi-tenancy has not been as much of a focus because of the fact that the cloud vendors like Microsoft and Google and others want you to spin up as many cloud services as you can, because that's how they make money, right? So, for example, an app service, right, on Azure. right? I could spin up an app service on Azure and run a website out of it. Like that app service is capable of so much more than just powering one website, right? But in order to do that, you need a multi-tenant solution, right? Which understands how to like serve content for multiple, perhaps multiple domains, right? To have multiple websites. That's multi-tenancy. And so essentially like a framework like Oqtane, which provides multi-tenant capabilities, does not align well with the cloud provider's ability to make money. So you can see why Microsoft's not motivated to provide multi-tenancy as part of its tool set. But I mean, this tool is valuable for the, the .NET community to have access to. One thing that .NET Nuke had, which was a bit of a limitation, I would say, is that it only supported a shared model for multi-tenancy, meaning like, so you'd spin up an instance of .NET Nuke and all of the clients that were served out of that were managed in the same database, right? So there was no partitioning, there's logical partitioning of data in the database, but essentially it all ran out of one database. And that had issues for scalability. It had issues for data privacy, right? It had its share of issues if you look at it from that perspective. From a cost perspective, it's great, right? Put them all in one database, for one database. That's good. But there's a lot of environments where you can't get away with that. And so with Oqtane, I created a different model called isolated tenancy as well, so that you can still have the shared runtime instance of the framework that like runs in one app service, so to speak. But you can have different sites that are defined in it, and each of those sites can actually store their data in a separate database. Right, that's isolated tenancy, at least at the data layer. And so that provides a lot of benefits, right? So ultimately, the data can scale a lot more easily. It's a lot more portable, right? You can move a single database to another environment, like connect it to a different app service if you want to at some point. So there's a lot of benefits to having an isolated tenancy model at the database layer. Another thing that .NET Nuke never supported, of course, because it was a Windows-only solution, was multiple databases. And because Oqtane is built on .NET Core, and .NET Core is cross-platform, it kind of makes sense that you're going to need to support multi-platform databases as well. And so that was the original idea, is like, okay, if someone's going to run Oqtane on Linux, they're probably not going to use SQL Server, right? They're probably going to use Postgres or something else, right? Something that's more native to a non-Microsoft platform. What I found out later was that there's other reasons to support multiple databases, and a big one is every shop probably has multiple environments now that they need to support. And it's very costly to have fully licensed versions of databases in every one of your environments. And so maybe you're going to use something like SQLite in development because it's much more lightweight, more cost effective, and then SQL Server in production, right? So you can, in order to do your application development, you can get away with using some other type of a database in certain environments and then have a more robust database in production. So this is another great reason it turns out to have support for multiple databases. EF Core was designed to support multiple databases, which made it quite powerful. But the one thing that EF Core doesn't provide is great migration support that works cross database. For those of us, I guess, who are familiar with like database development, obviously SQL is a pretty decent standard when it comes to just doing transactional stuff with databases. But when you get into actually like creating tables and altering database structures, right? Every database has its sort of own dialect for doing that. That's where it gets a little bit more complicated. From a security model perspective, this is also kind of interesting in that maybe 5 years ago, maybe more than that, there was a real move in the industry away from cookies, right? Basically, people said, oh, cookies are bad. We should be using tokens for everything, right? And that's when like products like Identity Server came around being super popular to basically have a separate place to manage your token creation, your authentication for your application. More recently, I would say in the last couple of years, the security folks have now said, tokens aren't always that great. I mean, having like tokens in the browser in the client isn't always a good idea. And in fact, cookies are not such a bad idea because cookies have a lot of sort of security aspects to them that make them quite useful in a lot of situations, especially if it's like a same site type of a model, right? Where your client is connecting to a server and they all run on the same domain, right? That just works. Like that's what cookies were designed for. And the information that is stored in them is encrypted, and you just get a lot of benefit from using cookies. So there's been this movement back to using what's called a backend for front end, BFF security model. You probably heard this term a few times. Some people wonder what it is. It's essentially going back to using cookies again, right? But they don't want to say that they're using cookies, so they do call it backend for front end. Everything that is old becomes new again. There are still certain scenarios where using JOT tokens are still preferred, right? So if you have truly like remote client applications that you want to secure, or you're interacting with remote APIs that are perhaps on a different domain, right, on a different server, then you should still probably use JOT tokens for that. But there's certain scenarios that cookies work really well for. And then the other thing is like using identity providers has become like pretty common now. Most often people don't want to manage authentication within their own sites anymore, right? They want to rely on maybe Azure Active Directory, or they want to rely on some other identity provider, right, to provide management for the user accounts. And so OIDC, right, it's become, OpenID Connect has become sort of the standard way of doing that. There's, and that's an industry, not a Microsoft thing. And so like OIDC makes it pretty easy to interact with the different identity providers. Did somebody have a question?
You dropped and rejoined.
Okay, no problem. All right. Similar to .NET Nuke, the concept in Oqtane was that things should be very dynamic and composable, meaning like you shouldn't be hard coding the various aspects of your application into every page, so to speak, of your app, right? There should be a way that you can abstract the configuration somewhere else, and then at runtime, it uses that configuration to create your user interface, right? By reading this configuration and figuring out which components belong where and rendering them dynamically, right? So instead of like hard coding references all over the place to things, this was the model that .NET worked with, and this is the same model that I followed with Oqtane. It's got some benefits in order to have this sort of abstraction model. And then building modules, so this concept of a module, this is the way that you would extend .NET back in the day. This is the way that you would extend Oqtane as well, right? You would build a module, which is a distinct and separate project compiled into its own assembly and then packaged into its own Razor class library, which is a NuGet package ultimately, right? This is the distribution format for an Oqtane module. Again, your modules should be built in a client server manner. So you have a distinct client application and a distinct server. This architecture allows your components to work in the most scenarios, I guess, so to speak, right? It allows them to work on Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, and Blazor Hybrid, right? There are ways that you can build Blazor applications that don't follow the client server model. So a lot of folks that only are focused on using Blazor server. So if you're using that model, because all of the Blazor server components run only on the server, you can include data access code directly into your components, right? Because they're running on the server. That works just fine. But the moment that you then try to use that component in a different hosting model, like WebAssembly, those components can't access the server, right? So they don't work anymore, right? So that's why I'm saying, like, if you build things in a client server way, they work everywhere. Localization, I know that, like, if you're building applications that are catering mostly to a US market, often you kind of think like this isn't that important. This was hugely important for adoption of .NET Nuke worldwide back in the day, like the ability for people to translate the user interface into their own native language. I mean, there's a lot of countries that actually mandate that software developers, have to create applications that are in the native language, right? The official native languages of those countries. And so it's important to have this localization capability built in. And so Oqtane does provide full localization for the whole UI. One of the other big things with .NET Nuke was that it had a marketplace, right? It had a store. Originally, the store was called snowcover.com because it was created by a third party. Later, NTN Corp acquired Snowcover and sort of had a store. The concept though of a store, if you've used like other CMSs like WordPress or others, right? It means that third parties can build extensions for specialized purposes, like maybe you need a blog or maybe you need a shopping cart or like various types of functionality. Some of that functionality is pretty general purpose, right? It would be applicable to multiple users of the of that software platform. And so that provides an opportunity for ISVs to create products that are extensions to the platform and make those products available for sale, right? So Oqtane has both the ability to support free open source extensions, because there's an open source category, or commercial extensions as well. So there's a couple different models. You build things in exactly the same way. It just depends on what your business model is, right? In terms of whether you want to just provide those capabilities for free to the community, or whether you want to charge for them. Of course, if you charge for things, then you are obligated to support them as well. And so there's like an extra level of sort of obligation that's part of that model. And one of the other things I think that was like a big challenge when it came to a framework like Oqtane, even Blazor to some degree suffers from this, is like it does so many things that it's sometimes hard to position it, right, on how to describe it, right? Like Oqtane, yeah, it's multi-tenant, multi-language, multi-device, cross-platform, supports multiple IDEs, you can build multiple apps with it, supports multiple hosting models, like so it's like so adaptable and versatile that it's sometimes hard to describe it, right, in terms of like what is it exactly. And so I had like a lot of like these kind of conversations of like early on, I was trying to position it as a web application framework. So a modular framework for building applications. And I mean, that's still ultimately what it is focused on. It's more for developers, right? It's more for developers to help them build applications more quickly. However, when a developer sees Oqtane and sees like the ability that you can just download sort of extensions and install them at runtime and things like that, they're like, that's a CMS, right? So that's like immediately they'll say that's a CMS. And so it was like, okay, well, I guess I have to say that it's, I can't just say that it's a developer platform. I have to maybe use the CMS word. I was trying to avoid using the CMS word for the longest time. Now I just say I guess it's both. But again, it comes back to positioning, and it's sometimes hard to position these things if they're so general purpose, right? If they do more than one thing. And sometimes people have the question of like, so what, like talked a lot about .NET Nuke, and of course I was the original creator of .NET Nuke, and now I've created Oqtane. So like, what is the similarities between these products and how are they different? And so From a feature set perspective, they are both multi-tenant, right? They're both modular, they're both composable, and they can create a UI in a dynamic way at runtime. They're both open source, they both support localization. So from a concept or feature perspective, they are quite similar. But from a technology perspective, they are like totally different, right? There is really no shared concepts or like technical concepts between them. So where DNN was like only ran on Windows, it only supported .NET Framework. It only ran on SQL Server. It used web forms as its UI technology, and it was purely server side, right? Using web forms, a monolithic app, so to speak, and only supported web scenarios, right? Like browser-based applications. Oqtane is cross-platform because it's built on .NET Core, supports multiple databases. It uses much different UI technologies, right? It uses Blazor. It's client server, service oriented, and it supports like many devices, right? Because it supports web, desktop, and mobile. So completely different from a technology perspective. Originally said I started this in like 2018. There's been quite a few releases of it since then. And in fact, I released the 5.0 version today for .NET 8. And I would say that because Blazor is, I guess, a fairly hot technology from Microsoft, and there's been a lot of investment in it. As I've been upgrading from version to version, I haven't run into very many issues. Like as I moved from one .NET version to the next. So moving from .NET 7 to .NET 8 was, in fact, very simple. Like I think I had to make one compatibility little code change in the entire application to get it to run on .NET 8, right? Obviously, I had to update all the packages and the .NET framework, but from like a compatibility perspective, Microsoft's done a really great job with these, so to speak, .NET Core releases, right? It allowing you to upgrade applications from one to the next. So that's been a good experience. All right, so we talked a lot about Oqtane. Let's actually see how it works. All right, so like I said, the Oqtane solution, like, so this is the source code that's available on GitHub in the repo. I don't know if I have that. So this is the Oqtane site. This is the Oqtane repo. So Oqtane framework, right, on GitHub. So I have the latest code that's in this dev branch locally here. Like I said, the solution is broken down into the client, the server, and then there's a shared project as well. This followed along the guidelines of the original, like I said, Blazor WebAssembly template that Microsoft provided. So the client serves, it has all of the components in it, the UI components. The server has all of the backend APIs, the repositories, and then the shared project actually has your models. And I know that not everyone agrees with this approach. This was the approach that Microsoft kind of provided in their template early on. But the idea here is these models are shared because they're used both on the server and the client. I know that sometimes purists would say that you should have dedicated models for the back end and for the front end and blah, blah, blah. But the Oqtane uses shared models between them. I have the app settings.json file open. It's actually one of the ideas with Oqtane is to not have a whole ton of options in app settings. A lot of the options should be stored in the database. Important one though is the connection string. So Oqtane obviously uses a database to store a lot of the configuration. By default, I don't have a connection string. So if I run this application, it's going to recognize that I don't have a database configured right now, and it's going to present me with an installation wizard that allows me to walk through the creation of the database automatically, which is kind of helpful. So I have the ability to choose from the different databases that are supported. So LocalDB would be, one that I would typically use. I have to specify an account that I'm going to use to log into the installation once it's up and running. And then I have the ability to also specify a template, which is going to have a certain amount of content that's part of it. So I have just a couple of built-in templates. Developers can build their own templates if they want to. It's essentially just code. So I use the default. And when I say install, it's going to go ahead and it's going to run all of the migrations that are defined on the database that I've specified here. And it's going to also execute this site template to populate the site with content. And so this is what a default site looks like in Oqtane. It's got a few pages in it with content. If I go ahead and I log into this instance, and for login, it does, for development purposes, it does have a local login capability using the .NET identity system.
Got a question?
Yeah.
Todd in the chat.
Yeah.
Asking regarding NuGet model for a module. Does the module include the client as well as the server regarding the Oqtane module?
Yes. Yeah. So when you package up your module, you would package all of the assemblies that are part of it.
Got it. Okay. You also made a comment that it scales nicely too earlier in your presentation of Oqtane. So I did get a chance to say that.
Okay. Yeah, so once you're logged in, then you have, obviously, you're a more privileged user, so you have access to some of the features. Similar to the way that DNN worked, you can have a sort of like an unlimited number of pages that are part of a site, because they are all just configuration, right? There's not like it's not using static routes that are part of the application, right? The routes are abstracted into the configuration system. So you can have an unlimited number of pages that you have in the site. So this site has 3 different pages that are part of it. And then pages are made up of different regions. So if I go into edit mode, I can see that this theme that I'm using has a default pane, which has a bunch of content in it, but it also has a whole bunch of other panes, right, that I could actually place content in dynamically. And that would all be defined in the configuration system. Like right now, each of these modules, it only comes with one sort of front end module, which is an HTML text module, which manages content. This is another reason why people think it's a content management system. And it has like a rich text editor, right, where you can manage the content and you can upload files and things like that as well. Modules also have settings, and it has a robust sort of permission model as well. And both modules and pages have permissions that you can set. By going to the control panel over here, this is where I can add additional pages or edit pages, delete pages, and I can add modules of different types to the page, to different regions of that page. But if I go into my admin dashboard, you'll see that there's a whole lot of admin functionality that's also available, right? So I have the ability to define configuration for this particular site. I can manage the list of pages that are part of the site, the list of users. So it's got like an actual UI on top of the identity system running like Blazor components, right? To manage users, to manage your profile, so you can set up all the different profile settings that you want to maintain for users dynamically. You've got ability to set role, manage files. You can define sort of your URL mappings and how to handle like 404 type of scenarios. It's got a full event log behind it as well. So any event that happens in the system, not just errors, but any type of event or log to an event log that you can actually view through the system itself. Site management is where you would go in and you can create multiple sites. Actually, let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to add another site. I'll just call it a test site. I'll give it a unique URL. So it'll be the domain/test. That'll be my unique URL for this site. And by default, I'll just actually let's use the Blazor theme, the standard Blazor theme. And here's an example here. So by default, when the application first installs, it uses Blazor Server. However, you can also specify that you want to use Blazor WebAssembly if you want to. So this is something that I don't think a lot of developers understand about Blazor. Is like initially when people approach Blazor, because of the way that Microsoft created the templates, you either choose a server template or you choose a WebAssembly template, right? And it's like right from the get-go, you've got this fork in the road. Like, what do I choose? Ultimately, you can have an application, like a Blazor application, that supports both, right? It's ultimately the way that Blazor works under the covers is essentially that is driven by a single JavaScript file that's in the root of your application. So a Blazor server application has a blazor.server.js JavaScript file that has to be included in the initial request that the browser makes. WebAssembly has a blazor.webassembly.js. Like that's it. That's the only difference between the two. So an application can support both.
I was curious if there was some kind of subtle implementation thing downstream that would manifest
So-
itself if you, but.
Yeah, so the only thing that's downstream is if, again, it comes back to this sort of client-server architecture. You have to have a distinct client and a distinct server. Whereas if you, I think, use the Blazor server template, it just creates one project and puts your components in the server project, right? And then you don't have that separation, which means that if you try to then, maybe just change the reference to the Blazor WebAssembly.js, it won't work because it doesn't know which assemblies need to be downloaded to the browser, right? Because you haven't separated it properly. So that's the big difference. Is it's architecture. It's actually not like anything more technical than that.
I guess what I'm thinking, I guess they're proposing you could use entity framework queries in your front end code if you. I didn't seem like a good idea to me anyway.
Well, yeah. Like I said, if you're running or if you're creating a Blazor server application, you absolutely can do that because it's running on the server. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that kind of limits you to only ever running Blazor server.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll choose Blazor WebAssembly. The other thing you have the option to do is, I want to put this site in the same database, which would be the shared tenancy model that I talked about earlier, or, I can create a new database, right? And actually have this site with the data stored in a separate database, right? If I say save here, it created a new site on this /test, URL. And it used a different theme, right? It used the standard sort of Blazor theme that we're used to looking at. And it, used the default template to, create the same set of pages essentially. But now I have two different sites, right? I have a site that's at the original location. I go into site management. I have a site, the original location and the one here. So I have two different sites that are part of this installation now. And so like, this is again, the cool thing about this. Like, for example, I have an Azure app service account at the B1 level, which is like $49 a month, right? For that kind of level. And I'm running like 15 different sites out of it, right? And so it really brings the sort of cost down by doing multi-tenancy. Of course, like if any of those sites all of a sudden became super popular and had a ton of traffic, I could then decide I want to separate those out into separate app services, right? So they'd scale better. But I mean, you can manage that. You can kind of keep, you have to manage sort of the ultimate level of performance and traffic that you want based on the number of sites. But multi-tenancy does provide that capability. So the other thing I guess I will show you is if we go back to the original site. So it's serving content here. And by having it up and running, the server aspect of Oqtane is running, right? It's got APIs available. And so I'm going to go into an Oqtane MAUI solution. And the way that this works is that there is a configuration file, an app settings file, which there's this abstraction that Maui provides, right? So you can store information in this app data directory. And so if this was running in Windows, it's going to have a certain directory. If it's running on Android, it'll have a certain location, iOS, certain location. Anyways, an app settings.json file. And essentially, the Maui application needs to know where to point to get access to data, right? At least in this example. And so in this case, I'm going to say I want to point this Maui client application, which is essentially a Blazor hybrid application, at my web server, like my server-based application that I'm already running. And when it spins up, what it's going to do is it's going to connect to the server, and it's going to say, okay, what components do I need to download to this Maui client that I need to spin up, right, in this WebView component. And then I'm also going to make calls to the server to get access to any of the configuration for the site. And so if I go ahead and I run this, I'm going to use just the standard Windows machine emulator because that's the simplest one to deal with. It's the fastest. If you're dealing with Maui, sometimes some of the emulators are a little tricky to get up and running. It's already configured to point at that localhost 33457 address. And so it's building now. And when it spins up, you're going to see essentially a Windows client application. And it's downloaded all of my components that were part of my application. And it's rendered the UI in a desktop, right? Like this is a desktop application at this point, but it's running those same Razor components that were running in the web context. It's now running them in Maui, right? You know, on a desktop. Similarly, the same application, the same components could run in iOS or run on Android, right? That's how you can reuse code across these things. And the functionality is identical, right? I can log into this desktop instance. And I have all of the exact same functionality, right? To manage through the desktop. Yeah, question?
Todd, if you want to come up, you know.
So Shaun, is this actually, I guess, is this running a WebAssembly in Maui?
Okay, yeah, so that's I think the biggest misconception maybe about Blazor Hybrid. So Blazor Hybrid, it downloads Blazor Hybrid, it actually runs the components natively on whatever device it is. And it's not using WebAssembly and it's not using SignalR. It is actually running the components.
So it's running native.
Native, yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had an additional question regarding licensing. So I work for a company that builds insurance applications. If we were to use this approach, is there a licensing for commercial use?
For
For
Oqtane?
Oqtane? Yes.
There's not yet. I've had this question a lot, so it's like a lot of companies need the support aspect, right? For a project like, of course, they're happy to kick the tires on an open source solution, but often like companies need to have a commercial license, right, in order to have support.
Correct.
So I'm getting this question a lot lately. That was always the plan. I was actually hoping to get to .NET 8 and then, because I've actually created a company around Oqtane Labs.
Right. I knew that.
Yeah, and so that's like the plan is to have a commercial version of this, which I think it will happen before the end of this year.
Okay, good, because I think that's the issue that we're seeing is we're in .NET, we're in .NET proper, whatever, 4.7, and it's web forms and it's archaic. I mean, it needs to be updated, and this would be a good approach, and that's why I was thinking about this.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I'm getting that feedback a lot.
Good, that's good.
All right, so I'm going to close this down now, and we're going to transition back to the running instance of Oqtane. And so the idea with Oqtane is like, originally, it wasn't conceived to be like a content management system, although you can see that you could add pages and add content to pages, and that feels a little bit like a site builder, right? But that was not the original intention of it. So typically what people would want to do is extend it with other types of functionality that's specific maybe to their organization. And getting started with any type of a framework is sometimes a bit of a challenge because you have to understand the nuances of that framework. So if I go into the module management area, there's a button that says create module. And so if I go in there, I can provide some very simple information. So let's say that's the name of my company, and we'll just call this ONETUG. And I can choose from the default module template. And what's going to happen here is it's going to scaffold a completely functional module for me, all of the source code that's needed. And it's going to put it in this folder. So copy that, create the module, and it created the code for me. And so let's go look at that directory. So it's scaffolded out like a solution file, all of the project files that I need. And so if I open this now in Visual Studio, and this has all been upgraded to .NET 8 as well. So even the scaffolded module uses .NET 8. And of course, and the module is like I said, architected in the client server way, the same exact way that Oqtane itself is as a framework. You got your client project. In your client project, you will have your components. You'll have your services to call the backend. You'll have your server project with your controllers. This time it's just got one controller. You've got your migrations to actually create a database table. You got your repository, got model, and it just used like the tokens that I provided as part of that like module creation wizard, right? To scaffold all of this code. The most important thing to understand here is it's also got this weird package project. This is essentially a post-build step that's run. So when I compile this module, it's going to execute this debug.cmd file at the end of it, which copies the DLLs that are created into my Oqtane framework bin folder automatically. So it's sort of like, because this project is outside of Oqtane, it needs to deploy the bits into Oqtane, right? So that when I run Oqtane, it's aware of the module, so that it happens automatically without you having to do any sort of extra manual registration. So if I build this, it built it successfully, and then it copied the DLLs over. And so now if I go back to my Oqtane instance and I run it, on startup, it's going to recognize those new DLLs that are in the bin folder for Oqtane, and it's going to run the migrations automatically that were part of that module if it hadn't done that before. So it creates the database table for you for this module. And we'll see that that module is auto-registered. There it is. It appears in my list, and I can add it to my page. And I added it to the bottom here. Let's go into edit mode here. Let's move this to the top. And let's say I want to add a record to this. It added the record. I can edit it. So it's got, basic CRUD capabilities I can delete, right? So that capability up and running, right? So it gives you a great starting point with a functional module that you can then experiment with the code to modify to meet your own needs. So the interesting thing is, so by default, this site is running Blazor server. And we can see that if I go into the site settings, I go to the hosting model, running Blazor server on this particular site, right? If we go to that other site, go to this site's running WebAssembly, right? Let's go to this private page, and we will see this module is available in this site as well. There's ways to restrict it to only exist in certain sites, but by default, it's available to all the sites that are part of the installation. I add it, and like I said, so this module, because it was built in a client server manner, it'll work on WebAssembly as well. right? And now let's go back to the Maui instance again and run it. And on startup of the Maui instance, it's going to connect to the server and it's going to recognize, hey, there's another module that's available. It's going to download it to the desktop Maui client and make it available here as well. So if I log, well, actually, you can see that it's already running, right? Because it connected to that site. If I log in, you can see that this module is actually running now on the desktop, right? Natively within this desktop application, and I can add functionality like here. So that, I created one module, was deployed to the Oqtane server, and then that enabled that module to work on Blazor server, Blazor WebAssembly, and Blazor Hybrid. So it's, like I said, pretty adaptable from that perspective.
Question. Mobile. So, sometimes you're writing mobile versions, the same site, you can use responsive CSS,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Does Oqtane have, some way of sort of gracefully,
So it uses Bootstrap.
okay,
Yeah, which is,
it's got it, pretty good.
yeah, Tailwind is, I think, really popular now as well, but Bootstrap provides a lot of great, and it's using the latest Bootstrap 5. So yeah, it's that's how you would deal with responsive design.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say like responsive design is not super easy still, like I'm sure you all had to deal with it. And this is where like sometimes you can run into situations where, yes, it sounds great to be able to use the same component in all these different device scenarios, but to make it look nice in all of them is a bit of a trick sometimes, right? Because you have the constrained screen sizes on some of them, right? And to make it responsive, it's still a bit of a front end black magic trick, right?
Sorry, we have a question. Rick, if you want to.
Yeah, I've been both using Blazor for a while and adopted Oqtane as well. Great framework. I appreciate it. One of the things that I've run into, and I'm curious if there's a way to work with this. Obviously, when I build components at the Razor level, kind of like in your framework, I can inherit from those. But I've run into a situation where I'd really love to be able to inherit from a module and put modules inside of modules. Is that something that it's just best to kind of separate that library and keep them as Razor components, or is there something that that already is available that I'm just missing that we can leverage a module inside of another module? So
yeah, so I think I understand your question. The one thing that I think and this is like the limitation of examples, right? Code examples or templates is they don't show you all of the capabilities that are possible, right? They give you a snapshot, an example. So the one thing that people don't understand, I think, is that like this was the scaffolded ONETUG module that we just created. You can actually have many different subfolders, right, in this modules directory.
okay.
So you could have many different modules that are essentially in this one module, right? Because this essentially this is a module project, but it can actually contain many different modules as long as they're separated into individual folders. And as long as the Razor components use distinct namespaces, right? So anything with the same namespace is going to be considered part of the same module. But then if you want, what you're talking about also is the ability to embed a module within a module. And in order to do that, especially if you want to be able to access some of the state, I guess, like module state and some of the built-in semantics that are part of the framework, you will have to use, cascading parameters so that the parameters are passed down automatically into your subcomponents. So that's where it gets a little bit more tricky.
Okay.
but it is possible, right? So the way that, so module base, right? I guess I can't see it there. If I go back to Oqtane, I'll stop this for a moment. And I can go into my client and go into my modules. And we look at module base, right? So there's certain, services that are injected here so that they're conveniently available to you in your modules. And then you have these cascading parameters. And in Blazor, that allows state to be passed down through multiple levels of the component hierarchy. And so that's how in your module component, like, your edit component or index component, you're able to access these types of state containers, right? So if you want to create additional layers beneath your module, you should declare these cascading parameters, and then they would pass through your module to the next layer down.
I got you.
Yeah, so it is possible.
Yeah, okay, cool. Thanks.
Right, so the only other thing I wanted to show you and talk a little bit about, I don't know if I have slides for this. Yes, I do. All right. So just briefly, we'll talk a little bit about .NET 8. Because .NET 8, I think, is a bit of a game changer when it comes to Blazor, which is crazy because we're like 5 or 6 years in and Microsoft just reinvented things again. But so up until this point with Blazor, when you built a Blazor application, it was considered to be fully interactive, right? Your entire application is interactive. And so you would build these components, and all of the components were interactive in a sense, right? They would rely on whatever the hosting model that was defined was. So if it was Blazor server, it would every component would rely on SignalR, right, for its UI events that were triggered, right? So if you had like an on-click event on a button, it's SignalR ultimately that is like acting upon that event. And in Blazor WebAssembly, right, it's using WebAssembly. In .NET 8, this concept of full stack Blazor is kind of turns everything upside down. So instead of the application being interactive by default, it's in fact non-interactive by default. So it uses static server-side rendering for the Blazor application, much the same way that Razor Pages or NBC works today. Why would they want to do this? Because interactivity is expensive. So in order to provide interactivity on every single component in an application, there's a lot of resources that are consumed by that. I mean, every single one of those components has its own event model, right? Its own life cycle that the application goes through. And when you're running things interactively, they actually get rendered twice. They get rendered server side and then client side. So there's like a lot of extra workload and processing that happens. And so Microsoft said, well, if you look at a lot of web applications, the bulk of the content that's served is actually static, right? It's not interactive. So why are we making the entire application interactive, right? That's limiting the scalability of this Blazor technology. So they said, okay, we'll change this up and we'll make it so that the application is statically rendered by default. And then for those specific components in the application that need interactivity, we can allow you to add an attribute and say, make this one component interactive. And that will make it much more scalable. And of course, they've gone well beyond, but this is like the biggest change, right? So up until this point, when you're building Blazor applications, you would just drag a button onto your component, you'd wire up an event handler, and it would just be taken care of for you because you know that SignalR or WebAssembly is there behind the scenes handling that event. In a static world, that's not there, right? So unless you're like specifically saying that your component is interactive, that button handler is not going to do anything, right, in a static world. And so there are techniques that Microsoft has introduced in .NET 8 so that you can basically wrap a form in wrap a button in a form, a traditional form, so that, and wire up the onSubmit event. That's all happening server side. And then the next question is like, so if you do that, then of course you're back into the world of a full page refresh, right? Which is what we were trying to avoid. But in fact, Microsoft has handled that too with some new enhanced navigation and enhanced form handling. You can put like an attribute on the form, and it will only sort of repaint the specific portion of the UI which is affected by that button click, right? With that component, right? So it can compartmentalize the UI updates, even server side, which is pretty powerful. So you can almost get single page application type responsiveness out of a server side application. Again, I don't think that Microsoft invented this. I think that like the folks from the Ruby on Rails community, they have, I can't remember the name of the technology, but they've been using it for like at least 5 years now, right? Where they're building server side applications and using other techniques, right, to be more efficient in rendering the UI.
So Shaun, is that a .NET 8 feature?
Correct. Yeah, this is a it's something that it's not like, so yes, it's a .NET 8 feature. You can't just like flick a switch to enable it, right? It takes some migration effort to migrate an existing Blazor application to utilize this capability. You do have to structure your code a bit differently. And there are, like I'm mentioning on this slide here, so one big change in .NET 8 was that routing completely changed as well. So prior to .NET 8, there was always this fallback route, right? Which would run after your API controllers and things. And that's ultimately where Blazor would pick up, right? Everything that fell through to that fallback was considered to be probably an interactive component of some sort, right? And you could act on it. In the new model, routing is a lot more deliberate. And so what happens at startup in a .NET 8 application is it evaluates the components that are part of your Blazor application and looks for the @page attribute, and then it builds a route table on the server, and then it passes that route table to the client, and then the client knows which routes it should be acting upon and which ones it should ignore, right? Because in a statically rendered world, it shouldn't be acting upon every single route that falls through, right? It should only be acting upon the ones that are interactive, right?
Cool.
So
Cool.
that changed. And then state management. So state management, this actually touches on what I was just explaining in the last bit there. So there's certain things that you did in Blazor traditionally to manage state across your application. One was using cascading parameters, where the state could be inherited across, hierarchical levels in your component hierarchy. That was convenient. The other way was you would register a scoped service, right, in your dependency injection container, and then that scope service could hold state, and then you could inject that service into whatever component at whatever level you're at and read the state. That all worked great in a fully interactive world. The problem that happens now is, like, as you make a transition from a static component to an interactive component, those are essentially different processes, and the state doesn't magically come across from one to the other, right? That basically, when you try to read the state in the interactive component that was passed from the static one, it's just going to be null. It doesn't pass at all. So you have to try to figure out in your application where your so-called render mode boundaries are, and then you have to marshal the state across manually. And so that, again, you have to kind of really look at your application and try to figure out the scenarios which need to be interactive versus non-interactive. And so it's not like a simple migration. Plan is, I personally think that this is a really interesting model, and so Oqtane is going to adopt this in the next version. there wasn't enough time to try and figure this out in 5.0, but in like 5.1, which would be probably in like January, I believe we will have like a model in Oqtane which supports the static rendering mode.
Excellent.
So that's, I think, the biggest change. And so I've been doing a lot of experimentation in .NET 8 about the server-side model, and I actually have an open source project that's available, so you can see some of the code. So this is like in a very so if you have a very large code base like the Oqtane framework, it's sometimes daunting to try and figure out how to migrate it to a new like architecture or like a new technique. I started down that path, and then it was like I ran into one thing after the other which didn't work, and it didn't allow me to even exercise some of the basic scenarios that I wanted to test. And so instead, it's sometimes better just to spin up a very simple POC, right, and try to experiment with things there. And so I took the default template for .NET 8 that was static, and then, but I chose the one that used WebAssembly because that one is client server, and I knew that that was going to be important. And then I introduced an app settings file to it where I could abstract some of the configuration, right? Instead of hard coding things into the various areas of the application, I abstracted them into the app settings. And then so you can play with the configuration, and it completely changes how the application acts. I defined a default render mode. So by default, it's set to static, meaning it's going to statically render everything. And then in the cases where a component is deemed to be interactive, it's going to use an interactive auto. And I guess I didn't talk about that yet, but so interactive auto. So the challenges with earlier versions of Blazor that were interactive was that Blazor server had a really great startup time, right? So a page would load very quickly, your app would load very quickly because it didn't have to do a whole lot of work just to get it up and running, right? It was relying on SignalR for the UI rendering. Blazor WebAssembly, on the other hand, sometimes had a much longer startup time because it actually had to download assemblies across the wire to the browser in order to instantiate them. And so those were some of the like differences in those different approaches. Blazor server had a faster startup time, but Blazor server suffered from the fact that your SignalR connection can sometimes drop, right? So if you close your browser, even if you minimize your browser, maybe the server got restarted. All those are scenarios where your SignalR connection is broken. And what happens in your Blazor application, Blazor server application, is it basically gives you a little message that says, you know, the connection's been lost, trying to reconnect, right? And it does a little spinning thing. Not a great user experience, right? It looks kind of bad. So that's Blazor server. Blazor WebAssembly had the slow startup time, but once everything was up and running in the browser, it operated as if it was an independent, like separate application, and you didn't have any of those like poor user experience problems. But so like neither of those models were perfect, right? Both of them sort of had pluses and minuses to them. In .NET 8, this interactive auto mode essentially allows the application to start up using Blazor server initially, to give you the fast startup time, and then in the background, it actually downloads the bits to the browser and switches over to WebAssembly. So you get the best of both worlds in that model, right? So you don't suffer the poor startup, and you don't suffer from SignalR disconnects.
So Shaun, is this available in the current repo?
This POC project
Yes.
is, but if you go to the Oqtane org, right on GitHub, it is here, Oqtane SSO.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, so you can come in here. It kind of describes a little bit of what the goals are for it and some of the changes that were made over the default template.
Sweet. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Dave.
Yeah, your jacket here,
Oh, yeah, you don't want that.
since it is raining. Yeah, and if you spin this up, it doesn't look pretty, but it gives you like some feedback on like some of the configuration details behind the scenes, right? So it tells me that my overall default render mode is interactive auto. Tells me that the theme, because I tried to use the same concepts that are in Oqtane as well. It's like the concept of themes, panes, modules. I wanted to try and make sure that this would all work seamlessly when we do the migration. And there was a lot of things that didn't work, and I had to find little workarounds for them. So by default, it's got a module here that's being rendered statically, right? Because it's got no interactivity. I go to the counter. This is the module that has interactivity, right? When I click it, it's interactive, and it's using this interactive auto mode. And then this is again static, but this is using also a new capability that's in .NET 8 called stream rendering, which essentially will start it'll render the UI while asynchronous stuff is still happening behind the scenes. And so that's kind of helpful if you're loading a lot of data in some scenarios, right? You might want to show a little loading message while that is like, so it'll render the UI, it'll show a little loading message by default. And then once the full data has been downloaded to the client, it'll show the actual data. And sort of just does this sort of automatically by adding an attribute in your components. So there's like a ton of new stuff in .NET 8 to explore, which is, it's again, it's like I thought I knew Blazor and now I have to learn it all over again.
Probably don't want to live in this location because you can't count on the temperature.
Yeah, I don't know where this location is, but yeah, this is the default data that's part of the strange template. Yeah, so anyways, you can experiment with this repo if you're interested. It is on GitHub, and I have been updating it pretty regularly as I play with new scenarios. In fact, like one of the scenarios I think that that I've been playing with is this idea that, so I have a service. The service here is basically just, this is in the server. All right. So if I look in the client, I have something defined as iText service, has a method in it, get text, right? I have an implementation of this interface on the client side, which is using HTTP client to call my API endpoint, which is on the server, just here. So when I'm running in a WebAssembly context, I do need to use a client server model, right, to get the information. However, if I'm running in a statically rendered server context, there's no reason why I actually need to make an HTTP client call. And so on the server, I have another implementation of iText service, which doesn't use HTTP client. And like this simulates it, but this would obviously probably do the database call. And so it would make the application run a bit faster by not having to do extra work, right? If I'm running in a server context versus a client context. So there's a lot of little experiments like that that are in here. Anyways, I think that I probably talked enough. I'm gonna lose my voice soon. But any other questions before we wrap this? More questions?
In the chat or raise your hand. Wrap this up.
I think it's scheduled for 2 hours. We're at 2 hours.
Well, we started a little, but yeah, so we're good if you're good.
I'm good. Yeah, I hope this was useful. I hope that there was enough information here that gave you like, you know, a
Very
more
useful.
in-depth review of
Very
Blazor
useful.
and stuff.
Shaun, I may be reaching out to you regarding our application.
Okay. You
Sounds
know
good,
where to
man.
find me.
Thank you. Thank you, buddy.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like people. Thank yous.
All right, I guess.
Any more questions? So thanks everybody who was participating. Oh, of course, I'm not.
Didn't turn my mic. I'll go on that one.
Sorry. Okay.
Picking you up here.
Yeah. I stupidly turned mine on. Yeah, so thanks everybody for participating on the .NET, virtual user group. You don't often get Shaun to talk at local user groups, so you got insights that, that he was sharing at the conference and now, but thanks everybody for coming. We had some delays on our end because of rain and traffic and everything else, but
All good, Andy.
those of you who are left, if you'd like to go, I have a different idea for the social. I'll run it by you, but I can't feed food or drinks through the web, so I'm sorry, those are people who are joining virtually. We'll have to drop you here and hopefully we'll see you at the next event we do. All right, so
Andy, thanks for all you do, buddy.
thank you, Todd. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody
Thanks.
turn off the recording, I think, Todd, since you started it.
I will turn it off. Thank you.
All right, everybody.